Hello, alive, oh. It's Friday afternoon and it's the 18th of February today, and it's blowing a gale out there. So this is a bit of personal therapy, reading therapy. I'm reading out of Lydia, which is a book about a reincarnation. Lydia being the central character. She was born on the 9th of March 2012. And this is a follow-on from a story I wrote quite some time ago. I started in 2006 and it was entitled Bliss After Life, and it follows the death of Bliss, who died after her 95th birthday. We are now at Lydia, and she is, she was born in March. We're now in December, so she's crawling around already, and there has been a list given to the group who was sitting together, and you will have to listen to the other bits, what this list is about. I am now at chapter 60, and it is entitled David and Susan, displaying in December 2012. David listened to Steve's voicemail in the morning. They had had all a late night. Chris and Holly had gone out with little Frida dog, and Susan was preparing lunch for them. They would set off back to David's place afterwards, but were making a detour to see Aunt Lene, David's aunt in Lymington, in the afternoon. Holly and Chris would pop into the refuge, both before driving home to the coast. He walked into the kitchen and replayed the message to Susan, a brief account of the little blue book, and when could they get together to talk furniture and so on. This sounds incredible. Susan was shaking her head. Steve was not one for exaggeration, and he had sounded intrigued. Give him a ring. We are back tonight, and if they fancy, they can come over and visit us as soon as they like, right? You know, shall we ask Lene if she fancies coming to ours for a few days? It sounds like she's had an exciting second cruise in October, and it would be lovely for her to meet Steve and Savannah. She knows all about the various relationships, as she quizzes me on the phone. She had Maisie and Alexander staying a couple of weeks ago. Okay, I shall ring her and then ring Steve. Here are Holly and Chris coming back. David waved and went into the conservatory to phone his aunt. Susan was telling Holly about the message, and Chris kept shaking his head and made his excuses. Frida had got very muddy, and he took her in the garden to clean her before she jumped on any furniture. He intended to take his time. It seemed relentless to him. He'd felt this list felt almost a little oppressive, and finding another book of this genre left him more confused than ever. Frida was wiggling, and he wrapped her into a ready towel to dry her fur. He decided to take her upstairs and give her a little blow-dry. She always looked adorable with freshly washed curls. This made him smile to himself, and Frida gazed at him adoringly. He felt happy they had a dog now. Soon she will have been with them a whole year, and he was surprised about the bond he had forged with this little furball, who had grown fully now, but was still below his knees, like a little black bouncy ball. He went into the back door upstairs to find the hairdryer, and he could hear David speaking to his Aunt Lene. Chris had only met Lene once, but had really liked her. He felt hungry and was keen to get back home after lunch. He fancied a really quiet evening, and a quiet week, really. He pondered walking up the stairs with Frida in his arms. He had earlier paid his credit card bill, and he noticed the interest he had to pay. What about this being wrong, according to Faye's research? They were sure high. He knew he could no longer ignore some of the points on this list. How was it with interest-only mortgages? He was frowning to himself and went up the stairs. Susan and Holly were discussing the book, The Only Planet of Choice. Both had now read it, and it seemed to give endless material for conversation. They found it astonishing that they found another book referring to the material, which had been much more extensively transmitted in The Only Planet of Choice, but still, both were curious what this new book entailed. It's only 53 small pages, said Savannah. I shall ask Steve if we can copy it or scan it. This would be a quick read. Holly was stirring the soup and Susan laid the table. David came back into the kitchen. My aunt is delighted to be invited, and I left a message for Steve that we would be happy to see them any time from tomorrow afternoon. It seems to me this will be interesting. He sat down. Chris came in with Frida, who looked so cute with her fluffy fur. He let her on the floor. What will be interesting? Dare I even ask? Chris pulled a chair and sat down. He was ready to eat. My aunt will come back with us to my place, and we expect to have Steve and Savannah visiting. We want to talk about the furniture with them and about the little blue book. He winked at Chris, all well aware that it was not Chris' favorite subject. Darling, it doesn't matter. It will all happen away from you. Holly kissed the top of his head and he relaxed. Yes, and what's the big deal anyway? David was laughing. For him, all these subjects were exciting, had been for decades, and Holly loved the sci-fi genre. Susan smiled at Chris. Don't worry too much, Chris. We are not alone. Everybody burst out laughing, and that included Chris. So what if he wasn't that keen on it all? They had got together more regularly since the list had appeared, and he liked that a lot. Hand me the bread. I need sustenance, because we shall set off soon after this. Frida had a good walk in the park, and I need my comfy chair. They knew he wasn't joking, and everybody tucked in. Chapter 61. Aunty Lene. She was so looking forward to David and Susan. What a nice surprise to be invited to spend a few days with them in his new forest cottage. Hillary's, as he still called it sometimes. She had been on 2 cruises this year. She had seen David since she went on a Mediterranean trip, but since she was back from her October Rheinfahrt, a trip to Germany along the Rhine with her friend, she had not had a chance to tell him about her new adventure. She was so happy that he had moved back to England. She was his only aunt, and she had no other relatives now. Going into the second half of her 80s, she was glad to still have her friend Eva, who was Russian and a rich widow, as Lene used to joke. They still met weekly at the club for a swim and a sauna, and both their trips had included their favorite activities. They were both convinced it kept them agile and active. She was going to pack a little bag, and she messaged Eva that she probably would not make this week's meetup, but if she fancied, she could pop over early evening to meet Susan. She knew Eva wouldn't miss that, and she set about to get herself ready for her visitors. She was still in her pyjamas, but they were very cozy. A present from Maisie. She decided to run a bath, a ping on her mobile, and Eva would come over at 6 tonight for drinks. This was going to be a good week, Lene thought, and messaged an okie dokie to her friend. Chapter 62. The Flat Conversion. Melanie had decided to drive down with the boys to the coast. She was so curious to see the progress at her home, and Pete needed to be back midweek to work at Evelyn's, so he would drive her back tomorrow evening. They had set off early and were at the flat well before midday. Tony had taken her by the hand for the last steps and told her to close her eyes when she turned the key in the lock. The smell of new greeted them, carpets and paint and just clean. They had stored a lot of the furniture in the garden sheds, and it would take a little while to have it all ready for the move-in. But when she opened her eyes to see the wonderful space, where there had been 2 little stairs, one leading to her door, and up a few more had been Tony's flat, there was now a big open space, with open stairs going straight to the loft. Rooms of either side, and Melanie was oohing and ahhing, walking on air. She had seen the blueprint, and she had it all explained to her, but this was magical and ingenious. Tony enjoyed her joyful face. He had loved making it the way they had envisaged it. The floors had been chosen from a small sample, and here was the lovely wooden floor in its new glory. Carpets in the bedrooms, upstairs the large living and kitchen area with warm wooden flooring, Milton's bedroom freshly painted but still bare of furniture. All these things had to wait, for now she was admiring their handiwork. They had slept on put-up beds, he and Peter, but the big settee was covered in dust sheets, and they moved it to make one of the rooms comfortable for them. Melanie and Tony would stay the night at Holly and Chris, and they were going to bring a takeaway with them. That is not getting as quite an evening as he had been hoping. Tony was laughing. His parents were going to set off after lunch, and he had already texted Holly that Melanie had come with them, but couldn't sleep in the flat. Your mum just messaged me that she pop in here. She is quite curious too to see the place. She hasn't seen it for weeks. It has been messy here, and we rather popped over to hers for lunch. Peter was laughing. He was glad they were able to feed occasionally at Holly's. He didn't particularly like takeaways on a regular basis, but they were going to stay there tonight, and Pete was going to stay here to finish some shelving. He was excited to show off their handiwork. They had quite a lot of help at times. At times there were 6 of them working on the space, but he felt satisfied with their work, which felt good. There isn't much here in the way of food or drink, as you know, but I can make us all a cup of tea. We even have a variety of herbal yogi teas. Tony had made sure to stock a selections. He liked them himself, and he put the kettle on. A normal builder's tea for me, please. Peter was parched. Chapter 63. Holly and Chris. Chris and Holly had set off after lunch from Susan's, and they'd had a nice drive. Holly had received a text from Tony advising them that he and Melanie would stay at theirs tonight, if that was all right. Chris was pondering over that. Obviously, Holly had messaged back straight away, okie dokie. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He had looked forward to a very quiet evening and had intended to go to his local little bookshop, where there were a few seats and some knickknacks to buy, and where he could sit and have a cup of tea, and there were also a wide variety of books, and he loved it there. Now, this looked unlikely. In fact, he had no idea what was going to happen, or yes, he did know that the list would come up yet again. There was no escaping the damn thing. What are you frowning about, Chris? I would have thought you were pleased to see our son so soon again. She had been dozing, marveling, really, because she had been thinking of sitting down to write again, and she loved the opportunity to talk to Melanie. There had been no real chance on the weekend, and she was close to the birth of little Milton now. Due date was the 21st of December 2012. No surprise there, thought Holly, smiling to herself. Well, to be honest, I had been looking forward to a quiet evening and had intended to go to the little bookshop tomorrow. Of course I'm happy to see the 2 of them. It doesn't really matter that much. I would love to have a chat alone with Melanie, Chris. Maybe you can go with Tony to the flat tomorrow morning and maybe then go to the bookshop. I shall drop you home with Frida and pop over to the building site now, but apparently is no longer that. I pick up Tony and Melanie. I know it's not far, but she was glad I messaged her just now. I doubt they will stay up late. Don't be annoyed about it, love. I look forward to them. She knew he'd come around and would be pleased to chat to Tony. She intended to take Melanie aside anyway. Another half hour or so and they would be home. She laid back to snooze. Chapter 64. Melanie and Holly. Holly had been as impressed as Melanie when she inspected the converted flat. She was so happy for them. It was less than 15 minutes' walk to their home. She could easily see herself taking Milton to the beach already now. They had all gone to bed early, and Holly was sitting in the kitchen the next day when Melanie came downstairs in the morning. It was past 10, and Chris had gone with Tony to his bookshop and for a snack. They would come back here after Chris had had a look at the flat, and Pete would bring Tony back. They intended to leave early evening, and Melanie was looking forward to her day. She loved Holly and Chris' house. Tony's room was unchanged, and they stayed the night in his old bed. Thankfully, he had a lovely double divan, which he bought himself with 16, he had told her. Holly had a beautiful room for her own purpose, which was generally writing. It wasn't big, but it had a lovely view into the garden. Good morning, Holly. I love your house. Melanie had Tony's old bathrobe on, and looked as if she was ready to give birth any time. She put her hands on her back and stretched backwards. Holly remembered those last days of pregnancy. For her, they were a mixture of joy and anxiety. And it all turned out well. She had the baby at home, which had not been on purpose, but little baby Susan had been at home. That was not on purpose. They had fairly regular visits from a midwife because of... No. She had been visiting, this midwife had been visiting when Holly's water broke, and although Chris was going to ring for an ambulance, the midwife decided there was no reason. She did not expect any complications. Bliss had been there, and Chris was sent into the garden. Tony was born 3 hours later. All was well, and Holly never went to hospital. Melanie, I'm glad to have you to myself. Come, sit down. I made some green tea. Chris and Tony are out, you know all that. Holly was laughing and patted the seat of the kitchen chair. Melanie was smiling at her. She was also glad to have some time with Aunty Holly, she said in her mind. How is Milton? Holly smiled at her and put the tea and cups in front of them. He's looking forward to meet Aunty Holly. Melanie was laughing. She might as well say it out loud. Holly would not be fazed. I love it. Holly clapped her hands. And I love JJ. The news of Anna's impending baby name had travelled fast. Isn't that just the best? I had honestly not noticed, although it was me who passed on the name Joseph. What's on your mind, Holly? Melanie turned to her. This might sound strange. Well, probably not that strange, but I'm reading chapter 4 of The Only Planet of Choice. It was entitled The Universal Civilizations. Melanie, it seems so complex, but what I understand is that a physical civilization called Altea, which in itself is an accumulation of millions of souls, that Altea is part of the 24 civilizations which started humanity. Then they're going on to say that there are sub-civilizations beneath, so to speak, of these 24, and they could also transmit messages, channel basically, but that could be distorted because they do not have the whole picture. Some are, and some have never been physical. And some have been, and some have never been physical. Now, that made me think of the story I'm writing. The entities of Alamo are not physical anymore. They were concerned with the well-being of all of humankind. It is always quite clear that when I write, that they are benevolent and really want to come and help. Do you think my story has anything to do with the 24 civilizations? Holly felt almost breathless. She had not read all of The Only Planet of Choice yet, but this chapter she had read twice. Melanie leaned back. Holly, shall we make a point of all of us getting together again? I have myself not read it all, and I'm learning along the way as you do. I sometimes wonder if Mio is learning from me as much as I am from them. Well, probably not as much as I am from them, but I think they're learning from me. She felt an agreement and smiled at Holly. Mio just gave me confirmation. We are on to something, Holly. And maybe it is time we make a plan to meet. I am due in 3 weeks. Holly put her arm round Melanie, and they smiled at each other. Milton was real, and JJ was real, and Lydia was real. They knew that, for sure. So that is the end of this chapter. And chapter 63 this was, and I'm wishing all a good Friday. And stay safe. It's very windy. In fact, it's stormy. Stormy weather.